Today I'm starting a new series on the virgin birth. This is the first video in that series. I hope to be done with the series no later than January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, even if I'm not done by December 25th, which is Christmas Day. I've entitled this first video, Mary Did You Lie?, imitating the popular Christmas song, Mary Did You Know? This video is meant to focus specifically on the idea of Mary as a potential witness for the infancy account, and especially the infancy account in Luke. It's particularly striking that the account of Jesus' infancy in Luke really focuses on the perspective of Mary, and in the same way, the account in Matthew really seems to come from the perspective of Joseph. That's something I'll be mentioning later as this series goes on. Of course, skeptics are going to say, well, Luke, who knows, where he got these stories from, or where this story came from. It was told by who knows where. But when we know something about the author of Luke, then that puts a whole new spin on things and a whole new view on things. I'm going to link in the video description below a lecture I did recently called Acts Gets Hard Things Right. And that just is the tip of the iceberg of the evidence for the veracity and the care of the author of Acts, who was also the author of Luke. This wasn't just somebody who was writing anything down that he happened to hear from anywhere. Moreover, he would have been writing at a time when very plausibly Mary would still have been alive, and he would have been collecting his material at a time when she would have been alive. I believe he was collecting his material for the gospel in the 50s. You can say, well, that's a generation later, but she is still going to remember what happened when she was in her teens. People have memory, and this would not be so long ago as to be outside of the reach of living memory. So it makes a difference what we think of Luke. And this is related to the overarching theme of this series, which is gospel reliability and reports of miracles. We can see how this comes in here, somewhat similarly to the way that it comes into the reports of the resurrection of Jesus. What if these really were told by witnesses? What would that mean? How would that change our evaluation? There are two different approaches, one more extreme than the other, that tend to take the attention away from this idea of Mary as potentially a witness. The first is the mythological approach, and you'll see this in Jesus mythers and their fellow travelers, that they'll try to say that there are all of these mythological parallels. These are very much exaggerated. I suggest you watch the video called Horace Ruins Christmas by Lutheran Satire. It's informative in itself. Many of these aren't even virgin births allegedly at all, even within mythology. But moreover, they're openly mythological. They're not connected, tied down to history. Even if you take someone like Danae, who's supposedly conceived by a shower of gold because the god had lusted after her and her father had locked her up, whether you regard that as a virginal conception or not, whether Danae existed or not as a Greek princess is very much open to question, whereas whether Mary existed or not, the mother of Jesus, is not. And in fact, she would have been a member of this religious community at its beginning. Acts mentions briefly, though not stressing it, that she was actually with the disciples there 6 weeks after Jesus' crucifixion. When they were out there preaching, she was there on the day of Pentecost. So she continued to live on among them. Another less extreme approach that just casts some doubt, you can hear Christians saying this, trying to acknowledge some concerns about the provenance of the virgin birth narratives, is that they'll say, well, she would have been the only witness. This can mean a couple different things. It can mean that she's the only one who would actually have known if she was a virgin or not, because that's essentially a private thing. Or it can mean that she would have been the only witness still alive at the time when the gospel was written or when the materials were being collected for the gospel. I don't think the former of those, about the privacy of virginity, is a very strong objection, especially since the accounts in Luke itself contains other statements from other people, such as Joseph allegedly having a dream, or Zechariah allegedly having a vision in the temple, and John the Baptist being born in his parents' old age and his father not being able to speak during his mother's pregnancy. Those would have been things that, at least in theory, other people would have known about. It wouldn't just be this private thing. Did Mary have sexual intercourse with someone else? Now, it's true that probably Joseph was dead by the time of Jesus' ministry. I actually consider this to be an undesigned coincidence among the Gospels, the casual appearance that Joseph had died. If they were made up, it might have been more useful for them to imply that Joseph was still around. But then also Zechariah and Elizabeth, of course, Mary's kinsmen, they were elderly already and would have been dead. That's true, and of course a public event that's witnessed by lots and lots of people, like we said about the feeding of the 5,000, where others later could talk to multiple people, is going to be better attested. But we can still look, as we will in this video and in others, at marks of credibility in the narrative, and if we have reason to believe that it came, or even plausibly could have come, from that witness, to ask questions about what the alternative explanations are, if it was not true. So if this came from Mary, she must have lied. Let's consider two different possible times then when she would have had to tell this lie. The first one would be during her pregnancy, when she would have had to say, to try to get away from being embarrassed or something, that she had a vision of an angel and that he said all of these things to her, raised all these expectations about the child, and then, hey, she turned up pregnant even though she'd never had sexual intercourse with anyone. I would say that's just overwhelmingly improbable. It's doubtful that the idea of a virginal conception would even have occurred to a young Jewish girl. It's not precedented in Jewish literature that a virgin, like a story, there are no stories where a virgin gives birth. The miraculous stories of the births of, for example, Samson in the Old Testament are of a different kind. They're usually of an older couple or of a woman who has been barren, and sometimes both. But not of an unmarried woman like that. So it's doubtful this would have occurred to her, but even more to the point, I think she would have known enough about human nature to know that it would not be believed. And in fact, it wasn't believed. Luke says specifically that it was supposed that Jesus was the son of Joseph the carpenter. We find that affirmed in other scenes in John and in the synoptics as well. Isn't this Jesus the son of Joseph the carpenter? So it would have been a completely pointless lie for her to make up during her pregnancy, and would have raised expectations about a perfectly ordinary child pointlessly. It would also have been very bold to make a completely made-up story right at the time that Zechariah and Elizabeth are alive about the birth of John the Baptist, and they're going to say, oh, none of that happened. What about Joseph? Would Joseph have been likely to believe it? I don't think so. If he was not the father, he would have assumed that she had been unfaithful to him, possibly that she had been raped. We find him in Matthew, very believable story, preparing to put her away quietly. So I think that's what would have happened. Even if she told him that she had conceived virginally, that's why in Matthew he has a dream where he's told to fear not to take Mary unto him as his wife. There's certainly no reason why, if he knew he was not the father, he should have connived at a story of that kind by saying, oh yes, I also had a dream. And not really any strong reason why he should have married her. On the other hand, if he is the father and he marries her, then everyone will just know that he's the father. So I would say it's just enormously far-fetched that she lied at that time. Now, the obvious response is going to be, no. The idea is that this story came up way later. So once again, we're focusing on the idea that suppose this story comes from Mary. Suppose that then, out of the blue, decades later, when no one's ever had any idea that Jesus is anything other than the son of Joseph, Mary comes up with this story in the 50s and starts telling it, letting it be published, letting it be known and told about. Something we need to remember is that James the Just, as he was known, who is spoken of in the Bible as the brother of Jesus, would still have been alive then. In fact, we have a pretty credible account of the death of James the Just later on in the early 60s. So if Mary's telling this story, and Jude, Jesus, also spoken of as Jesus' brother, would have also been alive at this time. If we assume that Jesus is born naturally, we think of these as just Jesus' brothers, they're making a position in the church on the basis of their kinship with Jesus. And suddenly Mary is saying, oh, they're only Jesus' half-siblings. Okay? And they're saying, I have never heard any such story as this before. This is completely unknown to me. They would have a reason to resist it. And we're familiar with Marian devotion in the Roman Catholic Church, and we think of it as a cause of glorification to her to say that she conceived virginally, that the child was the Son of God, and so forth. That's rather anachronistic. We should not assume that in this Jewish cultural context that would have been the case. There would have been some shame at the time in her conceiving by Joseph prior to their coming together, but that's long past. That's long over. For her to rock the boat later and try to assert this at a much, much later time is an entirely different matter, and is likely, I think, to encounter some opposition from the other siblings of Jesus who would have been around at that time. Even if you think of them as just being Jesus' close kin, which is the Catholic doctrine, for one thing, that doctrine is predicated on the assumption of the virgin birth and indeed of the perpetual virginity. But even so, for them to be alive at that time, they would have the opportunity to question it. Another rather important point that just occurred to me recently is this. Suppose that she starts telling the story, or even acquiescing in it as others are telling it, later on, just making this thing up. Oh yes, the child was the Son of God. Jesus was conceived. Mary was a virgin at the time. She had not had intercourse with Joseph. What idea does that raise in the minds of people, especially those who don't already respect her, who are maybe opponents of Christianity? Oh, she was unfaithful to Joseph. The possibility is then brought in, not simply that she's given birth to the child by having intercourse with her betrothed, but that she's had intercourse with someone else. The whole set of shameful possibilities is dragged back up and dragged back out, and she's then making this a possibility again by starting to affirm a story of a virgin birth that is not true, that she has no reason to affirm. She's got her position in the Christian church at that point. Why not leave well enough alone? So these are considerations that need to be brought into play. Obviously, it's somewhat easier to make up stories about the birth of John the Baptist that many years later, but even so, there were followers of John the Baptist at the time. It's possible that those could have been refuted. Even more strongly, I would say that Mary had motives against coming up with this story late, and that it is not at all clear that it would have aggrandized herself or that she would have thought of it that way. People do weird things. It's not as though she was suffering martyrdom for affirming that she virginally conceived. It's not that direct. People do odd things. We don't always know what people's motives are. So I'm not saying that these considerations are absolutely positively dispositive and knockdown, but I think they definitely push back against that idea, well, she would have been the only eyewitness. Well, okay, why would she have told this kind of story? So we begin to get this picture. Is she just a delusional woman? Is she a woman who is trying to find some way to make herself look good even though it's likely to make her look bad? What kind of self-interest does she even have in this? I think these are worth thinking about because, as in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, once we think of this as coming from a witness source, it makes a difference to our evaluation. Obviously, the skeptic doesn't accept that this came from a witness source. And in the next video, I'm going to be talking and beginning to talk about some marks of authenticity in these infancy narratives and the birth narratives of Jesus. So I hope you'll stay with the series. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. Be sure to hit the bell to get notifications. Follow my public content on Facebook. And as I need to say with Facebook's new algorithms, add me to your favorites list on Facebook so that you're sure to get all of my new content. Thanks very much for watching.